Thank you all for coming, and thank you all for coming. This is the Women's Caucus 5 years out panel. And as some of you doubtless have been in at least either a member of one of these 5 years out sessions or listening to one of them previously, you know that we were confronted with a list of 5 questions, 3 of which had 2 parts. So it was really a list of 8 questions, in any one of which could constitute a panel. So I sort of made an executive decision, like a politician and maybe like the debater that I used to be, that we would focus on the questions that seemed to me to start with needed to be answered, and we would go from there according to the interests of the people here and the other people here. So here's the plan, and we will do it or modify it as it works. The plan is for this to be an interactive session for you to contribute, and that's why you have in your hands what we have started with, as should be labeled across the top in big letters, draft of a timeline of the Women's Caucus. And if you didn't get one, there's one laying, I left some laying there on that chair. What we have done here is mostly fill in data from our memories, our collective memories. Some of you remember 2 years ago there was a panel, or maybe it was 3, two that Marlene and Fern did, in which they had sheets arrayed around the room, and we all filled in what we could remember. And then we went to Spectra and other records and filled in data. They're not totally correct. We found one specific error from that in terms of when somebody was chair, which either was an error of recording the data or an error that in the Spectra as it was recorded. So we would like to do our best to get the dates and people correct, but we want to fill in as well, so that the story that we put away in an archive of the history of this group is as accurate as it can possibly be. And from our point of view, that means correct the data that you have. So if you know anything that needs to be corrected on this timeline, added, changed, etc., please, we want to talk about that. And that I pose that to the people sitting here as well as myself. And then we would like to have some filling in of beyond the dates and names in terms of what we remember from those times. Right. Now, I started, and I was remiss in not introducing to you the people who are here. Oh, I suspect that's picking me up. I have little doubt that that's a fairly sensitive microphone they have there. So, appropriately arrayed at the end of the table to my left here is Carlin Coors Campbell. And I say appropriately for a number of reasons. And one of them is that among those of us at this convention, she is one of 2 people on the list that I know, on the list that was sent by Bonnie Ritter to the NCA, then SCA, or maybe even SAA then, I don't remember, but I think it was SAA, as having gathered at the 1991 convention and put our names down as members of a women's caucus to seek recognition. 71. Oh, yes, 1971, right. I'm one of the others. Sally Gearhart was another, and there were others who have stayed active, but Colin is one of those people. And she can help with some recollections, perhaps, I'm hoping, of the meeting the year before, because there was a gathering in 1970 as I believe it was New Orleans, by a group of women who agreed that this was necessary, made the arrangements to get the room for us to meet in San Francisco. I wasn't at that convention, so I wasn't there. So that memory is going to need to come from Carla. So I think that's a good place to start after I introduce the rest of the people who are up here. We tried to find people from the course of the now nearly, 40 years of the existence of this caucus who had led it at one time or another. Marlene Fine chaired the caucus.
I actually didn't chair the caucus. I chaired the division.
She chaired the division
Right.
shortly after we created it, right?
Yes, and but I did the newsletter for the caucus for a couple of years.
Okay. Roseanne Manziuk, you chaired the caucus.
In 2001.
2001.
And long before that, did the newsletter. That's how I got involved.
Important role, that newsletter. Lois South.
I chaired the caucus and hung around for a number of years before and after.
You chaired the caucus pretty early.
Yeah, 80 or what did I corrected the date here? In New Orleans in 87.
Oh, that late?
Sounds about 88. Right after
Okay.
Celeste, I think.
Okay.
And
Later than I thought.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry, 87. This
And
is wrong.
I never
have the corrected file at home.
Yes, and that our goal ultimately is to have a correction here. I never chaired the caucus. I sort of hung around from the beginning. Please, you all join the circle. Don't hang back. That's all right. We'll film you leaving. And Pamela Canamore to be chair of the caucus in
2012.
2012. So Pamela's our voice for the future. So we're perfectly arrayed up here with Colin there at the beginning and Pamela, who is going to be in the leadership as we go on. So let me start by two questions at this point. Our goal is fill in the timeline and then go on. The question first, I want to be sure that you all feel free when the time comes to fill in whatever you see here that's missing or correct whatever's here. But I want to go back to 1970 and ask Carlin to tell us what, if anything, you remember from that event.
I don't remember a lot of details. What I do remember is that we didn't meet in some special place. We picked a place to gather. I remember we were all standing up. This wasn't really a meeting room. And we began to talk about being activist in terms of getting a feminist caucus organized. So it was sort of morale and determination and planning and all that kind of thing. And I want to add a kind of interesting note. I went through this timeline and I thought to myself about the strange fact that, this all started in 1970 with our stuff. And I was in New York from 1971 and 1972, and in the spring of 1972, I think partly in response to the Feminist Caucus stirrings, I got a phone call from Lloyd Bitzer. And of course, in the old days, these things were done without any proper procedure, asking me to be a member of the research board. I was absolutely floored. And I'm convinced that we're going to sort of calm the activity that's going on in terms of women by doing something of this sort. But it was a very casual thing. I certainly remember Bonnie being just energetic and so active and so on, and so determined in terms of getting us together for what would be in San Francisco a more formal meeting.
Interesting.
I suspect as I look around there's no one else that was there at 1970.
Well, I'm actually now rethinking this, so you have to correct me. Was Judy Trent at that?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so I think it was 70 and not 71 because I did not go to the conference in San Francisco, but I was in New Orleans.
Right.
And I recall the reason I ended up coming was that two of the young women who mentored me, who were at that time teaching at the University of Massachusetts. Actually, they had left by then. Sandy Purnell was now a graduate student by then at the University of Minnesota, where I was also a graduate student at the time. And Ruthie Goldfarb had been teaching at UMass. I don't know if she was still there. But anyway, they had mentored me when I was at UMass. They were women who at that time had master's degrees, were then going on later for their PhDs. And they grabbed me and they said, something very exciting is happening, and it has to do with women, and you have to come with us. And I remember just being pulled off, and all I remember about the meeting, I'm afraid, other than how exciting it was really Judy Trent walking in and, click-clacking with these, stiletto heels, because there was no one in my experience, in academia who looked like that.
And we ought to all remember the kind of sexism that she faced the first time she ran for the presidency of this organization. And the fact that she ultimately became president is one of our real triumphs.
That's so true, and I'm so pleased that you voiced it, Carlin, because I remember at the time thinking the reason Judy lost that first time was how she looked.
And what were the dates on that? Do we know
gosh,
when she
I don't
ran
know.
the first time?
I'm bad at that, but she lost one election and then subsequently ran not very long afterwards and won.
Do you remember who she ran against?
Yes.
That way we can track it
There's
through
a
that.
Dale Leathers.
Ah, okay.
That was in 1992.
The time she lost.
That
But-
was 1992.
That's right.
He was president in 92, so it would have been the election was back in the
earlier.
late 80s.
90,
3 years earlier, at least.
80,
Yeah.
89, maybe?
Yes.
88.
Well, and that is a piece of data. I will make a note of Judy's first loss to get. We can get that from the website that some of you know about and some of you don't. There is a little piece of the NCA website under About NCA and then under History, where then there is a reference to the NCA Women Presidents Project. No, I think it says Women's Leaders Project, because we have been and continue to try to collect the stories of the of women who have provided leadership in various capacities, from editorial being editors to being in the offices to having run for office and not been elected. So we do have those dates for Judy. And we, in fact, could have it in here, but yes, I remember thinking at the time. I don't think that I ever expressed it to anybody that I didn't know well and trust that I believed that's why she lost, but I really do believe that was
And
it.
against a really lesser opponent.
Yes. I want to invite any of you. When did you all start coming? Let me ask that question. Dorothy, you've been around for a long time.
A long time. I started coming in the year of our Lord, 1978.
Yeah. So it's back in the 70s. And Cindy?
I started coming to the Women's Caucus because you made me. Actually, you volunteered me when I wasn't at a meeting to be the newsletter editor before, and that was with Jane Dale, had been the editor before, which we don't have, I don't think, on the timeline. And I'll have to go back and look at the data for who else was doing it, but Jane Dale had been doing it and was ready to give it up, and it got handed over to me because Anita volunteered me. I will say one thing, and I wish I had thought about this before I came. I do have a videotape interview with Bonnie Ritter that we did at the San Francisco convention that I programmed. And I remember her talking about the year before meeting in a room with a bottle of something.
That's on the
And so
timeline.
that might be something that if we
Oh,
look
that
at
would be
that, we
wonderful
would
to
be
have.
able to get some more
Right.
information about what was occurring in the 1970s that you're talking about.
I came because Anita told me to come too. So. She's responsible for this, which is good.
That would have been in 1989 in San Francisco,
Right,
correct? When
right.
you were
Yes,
Yes.
because
program
I was
class.
That's right.
She's
And we had
19 now.
right, exactly. We had a baby shower for ours.
Yes.
Right.
I'm sorry, I should know your name.
Lynn, I've only come occasionally, but I came today because I'm very interested in the history.
Good. Well, please contribute anything you can. And I'm sorry, I don't know your name either.
I'm Mary. This is my first time at NCA.
All right. Yay. Well, this is that triggers for me a memory of since, and that is of 1971. I came. That was not my first NCA convention, but it was my first convention after having been certified as a member of the club by having earned a PhD. I was one of those people who took a long time to get the PhD. And it was an interesting feeling, but I was still an outsider. And going to that meeting in that San Francisco hotel, arrayed around that room with people like Sally Gerhardt, Carlin Campbell, Bonnie Ritter, who was a spark plug, and that's why she's appropriately the name that endows the now scholarship award for the book award by the Feminist Women's Studies Division. And finally, and you all know what it's like to go to your first NCA. It wasn't as big then as it is now, but it's still overwhelming. And that was a place where it wasn't overwhelming any longer. Here was a relatively small group, and I felt comfortable and welcomed, and there were people who had the same concerns that I did. So that 1971 meeting was the meeting that let me understand that there really was possibly a home for me in this association. I had come because my graduate professor had said that's what you do to be a professional. But that meeting was
I don't know whether this is appropriate in terms of the timeline, but my first convention was 1958, and it was a terrible experience.
Yeah.
My advisor had been Bill Howell, who was absolutely towering person in the field. He was also the president of this organization, somebody who did beginning work in persuasion, and he was trying to help me get a job. I just was finishing a master's degree, and after having to get a loan to have my tonsils taken out, I decided I needed to go into the job market. And he would introduce me to men, and they wouldn't even respond to me. I mean, I remember men, and I've remembered when they've died and thought, good. Because they were so rude. They were just so incredibly rude. And, of course, my first experiences with getting a job were just awful, with hundreds of letters coming back and saying we don't hire women, we don't want a woman, etc. Everybody forgets about the extent and bluntness of the kind of sexism. So while the change that's occurred in terms of the reception of women, the assumption that they're absolutely competent in terms of getting jobs, et cetera, is such a transformation.
I want to add on to that. So my first convention was 1969. And I came because I was a senior in college, and Jane Blankenship insisted that I come to NCA, have my introduction, and also I was looking at graduate school, so she had arranged for me to have an audience with Marie Hopkins Nichols at the Illinois party, and then I, of course, went off to the Minnesota party and fell in love with everyone there. But for me, the experience was also, in retrospect, a negative experience. At the time, though, it was a very heady experience because the way men treated me was to try to go out with me. So that I was rooming with two women who were older than I was, two graduate students at the University of Illinois. All of these men came back to party in our room later after the Illinois party. And, I thought this was so cool. A few years later, when I was actually interviewing for my first position after just about getting ready to finish my PhD, I won't say which school interviewed me, but it was a major institution, and I had to go into someone's bedroom, be surrounded by all these men while I sat on the bed. Now, I'm not talking about going into a suite. I'm talking about going into a small bedroom, sitting on the bed, and having these men surround me and interview me for a job. It was terrifying.
Yes, I used to tell my students never to go under those circumstances.
I want to say something too then about my first NCA convention. It was 1972. It was here, and I was squired around by the one female faculty member in the Department of Communication. I had just sort of started. I was writing a master's thesis in history for UNC, but I was at Northern. Margaret Wood took me under her wing, and she took me around and introduced me, if I were properly attired. She had real clothing standards. You had to have an ensemble to be with Margaret. But she introduced me to the people that I, thought were all the heavy hitters. Lauren Reed, Sam Becker, Enninger, Oakes, I think Braden, later Gronbeck, people like that. They were all that Iowa male mafia. And Margaret was very concerned that I meet these people and I know who was writing the stuff that I was reading. And what I got out of that was that networking and knowing people is really, really important. And I remember going home and thinking, but I didn't really meet any women that were Margaret's cronies. How is this going to work out? Because I was pretty active in women's issues at that point. And I talked to a person who was then an instructor, Dorothy Bishop, and she made a special point the following year of introducing me to Mary Roberts, who was the first person that kind of made me feel really welcome in MCA.
We ought to pick up on Mary Roberts.
Yes.
We really should. Here was this editor of the speech teacher. I can remember her coming up to me after I presented a paper, I think it was at Central, and urging me to submit it to speech teacher, giving me that kind of support. And when I was at the University of Kansas, she invited me down to Pittsburgh to do a lecture. And of course, Mary was just the most wonderful host you could ever have. But it turned out she was looking me over very carefully to see whether or not Mary Ton ought to come to the University of Kansas and get appropriate kind of care and feeding and love from an advisor.
Oh, that's
I'm
wonderful.
very proud that I passed.
Yes.
You know, I want to share another story about that, and I wonder if there's a theme here about the way in which the women in the field believed in nurturing and mentoring in a way that's very different. Because I remember, and this is a negative about the University of Minnesota, but when Sandy Purnell went to Minnesota, she went through some very bad personal experiences, and they affected her financially. And I remember having a conversation with Jane Blankenship about it, and her comment was, why aren't the faculty taking care of her?
Yeah.
Why haven't they taken her in and taken care of her? And you know, it was this sense that that is your role. Your role as a faculty member isn't just the kind of intellectual mentoring that goes on, but you're supposed to be involved in the care and feeding.
Oh, absolutely.
And, you know, it's interesting because I will call on you. I just wanted to add to that. I think that happened to young men as well as to young women. And the problem for people coming in when Carlin and some of the others of us did is that there just weren't that many women there. So that, and the men didn't know how to do it for women. Yes?
I just wanted to say about mentoring that Carolyn was never at the same institution I was, but met me and became a mentor, and is the reason that I have a PhD, that I have a position, that I'm here.
Oh, you're sweet. Let's give credit to Martha Solomon in terms of her role in all this, too.
Martha was a treasure. I've been very privileged to have mentors. I left the University of Maryland before I finished my PhD, and then my advisor moved on, and I couldn't finish my PhD, and Martha took me on, having never had me as a student, and finished my dissertation with me. So women in this organization are extraordinary. Women who have no reason to mentor a particular person except they are kind and generous.
We kind of stopped right here when we were going around, and I know we have some people over here who have some history with this association. So,
well, it's interesting hearing everybody talk.
Tell us, identify yourself for the tape.
I'm Sandy Sarkola. Right now I'm at the University of Memphis. When I was in high school, Judy Trent was a high school debate coach at Belleville High School, and I was a debater in Lansing, Michigan. So I have these sort of indirect experiences up to when I started graduate school, I guess. And so that's one thing I want to point out, that Olive Carlin, you may not realize it, Judy Trent, I'm sure she doesn't realize it, the sort of indirect mentors and role models that I observed kind of stuck in my head a little bit. But at the University of Massachusetts, Marlene and I were classmates. I, however, did not, I'm a late bloomer, I'm kind of slow, but it wasn't really until 1989 that I got involved, and that was the year the Feminist Women's Studies Division.
Yes.
You know, a lot of personal things in my life. But at that point, I'm going to have to pass.
I'm Minnie Carey. I will be finishing my coursework in the PhD studies in rhetoric at the University of Memphis. Sandy is my professor, my advisor, my mentor. And this is my first time attending.
Well, welcome. Welcome.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
My name is Ann Burnett, and I just have to add to these stories too. My first NCA was San Francisco in 1989. I have a vivid memory of making a presentation, and the first question I got was from Carmen Coors Campbell. And it was a good question, and it was a tough question, and we engaged in a really good conversation, and I remember being so thrilled afterwards that someone like Carmen Coors Campbell was taking my work seriously. So thank you. That has been an inspiration to me throughout the rest of my time.
Julia.
I'm Julie Wood. I believe my first conference was 72. It might have been 73. But it was a number of years later before I discovered the Women's Caucus, and then a number of years after that when we formed Feminist Women's Studies. Because I didn't have Anita as my mentor to volunteer me and try to into these things. I didn't ever study with them. Three programs. I never had that possibility, or any women's studies courses. They didn't exist, of course, when I was going to school. But I'll just add to the Carlin story. So here I am, an assistant professor some years later at Carolina, and I get this opportunity to do a special issue of one of the journals, and I want to do it on women. I've now discovered that's what's interesting in life, women and women's communication. I don't know Carlin. I'm not in rhetoric, but, I write to her and I say, would you like to contribute to my special issue? And she writes me back, I'd love to. And I think it's that kind of paying forward that's been modeled for some of us, and that we try and do perhaps less well than was done for us. But I think we have learned the lesson that you really do pay it forward, and that's what you do. And I don't have your horror stories of the first convention, but I have stories that are worse than what you're experiencing now in terms of the sexism. And I know my experience was less sexist because of Carlin and Anita and Bonnie and Marlene and Lois. And people were in there fighting for it, and I think each of us tries to make it a bit better. And it's an ongoing process. It really is.
Well, and I'm talking a lot, but one of the things I think we have to all recognize, and Julia's a good example of this, is the importance of the interaction between first-rate scholarship and the activism of the Feminist Caucus. And part of the reason the boys couldn't ignore us is because we were doing work that was really great, and they simply had to acknowledge it. And that's the reason you have the kind of modeling of this sort of stuff, which I think is just vital in terms of all of this. I really do.
Yeah, that's a good segue to, in graduate school, what was really, really wonderful, even though I did not know you and know you personally, just to read wonderful scholarship that women were writing. It was really, really amazing. And then to come and see you, even that in and of itself was something else. And I'll have to say, Anita did. I just thought the Lord has sent me an angel, So when it kind of looked over me, she put my name before places, published in her book. She hired me for a job, and that's the kind of thing that, it really, because otherwise I probably would not have stayed with NCA that long. So it has just been tremendous.
I have to add, now that I've recovered my composure, Jane Blankenship was my lifeline.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
She hadn't constantly paid attention to where I was and what I was doing.
Yes, absolutely.
And Jane's an interesting example, too, with Marie Hoffman-Nichols not being the kindest, easiest mentor you could ever have. But Jane turned out to be this just fantastic mentor.
Yeah. That's great filling in. I love that.
I was going to say, just to add to the stories real quickly, for me coming to NC, I came out of the Iowa Mafia program, which not to say that there aren't some very good, kind people within that faculty, and Bruce Grunbeck, I would say, in particular. But it really wasn't until, and of course I was coming to conferences as I was a graduate student, but being shepherded around in that different way, meeting sort of the male stars of the field. And it wasn't until I didn't have an Anita to bring me along to the Women's Caucus, but I just kind of wandered in there one day, and it was the home for me. It was the incredible moment to be able to meet the women who I was beginning to read and was beginning to realize were also there and doing that great scholarship. And by gosh, all you have to do is volunteer once to be a newsletter editor, and you are in the pipeline for the rest of your career. So,
and I think it's important you mentioned the mentoring of somebody like a Grombeck. I think it's very important to recognize the horror stories that a lot of us had. I never had a female mentor, really, until I sort of adopted indirectly some of the people in the field, like, Anita and Carlin and others. But I do remember that the first person who really encouraged me at a national convention was Sam Becker, who heard me do a paper on feminist film theory and came up to me after the program and said, "That's really good, do something with that." I was not getting that in my doctoral program at Madison. Trust me, I just was not getting that kind of encouragement. So we need to recognize, as we used to call them, the men almost good enough to be women.
Right.
I'd like to add to that, too, because I also came out of the University of Iowa program, and I was fortunate enough. There weren't very many women there. The women that were there left usually before we completed our programs. I was fortunate to have Sam Becker as my mentor, and right as I was getting ready to graduate, I had been offered a position at Purdue, and Sam was really excited about it because it was Big Ten. And I said to him, I really don't want to play with the boys anymore. And Sam looked at me kind of stunned, and I said, I'm thinking about George Mason. And he said, the only reason to go to George Mason is Anita Taylor. And I said, well,
that's enough.
That's enough. I wanted somebody who was chairing a department that was a mentor that I could follow, not just through my graduate program, but past that. And Sam and I have talked about this, and he said, you were right. I was wrong. It was a good place for you to go. And that's the kind of person Sam is, that he'll argue with you on stuff, but in the end he'll tell you, you might have been, I could have been wrong, which was very
Well, I stumbled across Women's Caucus. My first NCA was 2007 here in Chicago, and I'm new faculty. I started at Kennedy King, a community college here in Chicago, and I saw that they had a Women's Caucus meeting. And we have a women's center on our campus, and it is totally dependent on the generous donations of people. But the director who started the Women's Center had actually funded the center so that the women that are attending college, and a lot of them are non-traditional students who have either experienced the empty nest or divorce or whatever reason that they came back to school. But she wanted them to have a place of refuge that they could come if they needed an ink pen, if they needed to make a phone call. We had a refrigerator so that if they're expressing milk, they have some place to store that. And so she adopted me, and she mentors me. And so when I was telling her about NCA, she wasn't able to attend, but she was very supportive of me coming. And when I saw that there was a women's meeting here specifically for women, I was just so excited, and I called her and I told her about it. She says, well, you must attend that meeting. And so I went with all this excitement and enthusiasm, and the Women's Caucus, they just embraced me and just made me feel so welcome. And the next thing I knew, I was running for an office.
I remember that moment. She stood up in the back of the room, and she said, this is my first time here, and I'm not sure what I'm getting into, but I'll do and we said yes.
So I sit before you today just so excited to be a part and looking forward to 2012 and the contribution that I would make. And it's just so wonderful to hear these stories, and thank you for laying the path for me. I'm just so grateful I don't have those horrible experiences, but you made it for us, and the new people made that way, and I really appreciate you paving that path.
I'd like to suggest that when we get this timeline done, that it not be exactly like this, that there be some stories with who have names. People have the right to say, don't put that story, don't put my name on that story. But
I think that's a great idea.
The stories fill in a reality of the time.
Yes. Yes.
Excellent suggestion.
Yes, and because we are so fortunate that we are being recorded, I haven't been bothering to write notes here, but that is an important thing, but we need to collect from others as well.
We do need to give that right of not my name, but I'll tell the story.
Yes,
Right.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And we all have them at different points. And the fact that even today you can still get some of those awful horror stories, but that there are so many more stories of having been welcomed you can go back to the 60s when some of us came in, or 50s, and each of us has the horror stories, but we also, the isolated soul here and there, usually male, but not always, because there were some women around. Some of us can tick off some of those women. And I came through the debate part of this community, and there were some really terrific female role models. I mean, people like Annabelle Haygood and Del D. Herman, whom I named yesterday, and Gracie Walsh.
Who was one of the most formidable people in
She was. And to debate in front of her, but they were, and I said this a number of times, I'm not sure I ever did have what I would call a mentor in the early days. The one that you would expect, I was a fortunate person that had a female graduate advisor, Dr. Frances McCurdy at the University of Missouri. But I could never, and she was kind and supportive and helpful in all kinds of ways, but I could never think of her as a mentor because she was far too meek. And the institution was totally mistreating her, and as a graduate student I could see that. And so this was not, but there were role models, and Carlin was one, and Annabelle Haygood was one, and there are others that I won't go through to name. At Illinois, Cheryl Kramer, who's probably my own age, but she was a model in lots of ways. So I'm going to follow your lead in where we should go from here. Yes?
Well, I wanted to respond to something that Carlin said before about the relationship between the scholarship and the success of the caucus, and not disagree with you, because I think that was absolutely critical that we had women who were doing scholarship of such enormous intellectual value and with such discipline was very important to the success of the caucus. But when I think about the caucus, I think about it as a haven for all women in the association.
Oh, yes.
And, I think of all of the mediocre men over the years who found their place in the association, who were able to find publishing outlets for their work, who were successfully promoted in the association, and that, I look to the caucus as a place where all of us had a voice and became people who had an opportunity in the field. And it is because of the intellectual leadership of Carlin and Julia and others that we were successful in doing that. But I really do think of it as a place for all of them.
Mm-hmm. I want to second that in a little bit of a personal tone, too. I have something like 49 unpublished, competitively selected conference papers. And Carlin probably still has in mind, you never delivered that essay on Crystal Eastman or the Dorothea Dix piece. And I'm looking at those files as I'm cleaning out my office and thinking, I made some different choices. I think of myself as intellectual and capable, but I didn't spend a lot of time writing. And I never felt, the writing that I did tended to be more in women's studies outlets, but I never felt really like there wasn't a spot in the Women's Caucus for people who were concentrating on administrative work, building programs, mentoring, teaching, and who weren't doing as much. So for me, it was always, I respect the ideal of the teaching and the research, and I certainly look up to my much more accomplished scholarly friends, around the table.
Yes,
but I think the caucus was always a very important place for all of us, in different ways, perhaps.
All I was suggesting was that in some ways, the fact that they couldn't ignore the kind of work that was going on.
That made more space for all the rest of us. Trust me, I am very appreciative of that.
There's a larger theme here, and it's not just about NCA and our caucus here, but it's, picking up on what you were saying a minute ago, too, it's about our campuses, too, You're doing some work on your campus, and I know some of what you've done that makes it possible for me to do my writing and not worry about having to take care of that fire over there. And I'm doing some work for you, and it really is this kind of marvelously intricate sort of a tapestry, but we need each other to do that, because the minute you stop doing the on the ground kind of fighting, we're going to be going right back to the kind of trash that some of these stories are telling us about. So that absolutely has to happen, and people, you're better at it, and Anita's better at it than I am. I'm better at writing than that, but I think we have to recognize that, and I would put teaching right on the table too. It's got to be happening in the classroom. We've got to be doing the education there too. So it really is at least a three-pronged stool.
You all know this, but I want to say it for the record, just simply because this is being archived and it's an important piece of the record. I think, and I do not remember where the idea generated, and probably as most ideas, it percolated and then the time was just there. But one of the most brilliant things the caucus did was give birth to the division.
Yes.
And I wish that we had had the camera recording yesterday when the division panel, feminist criticism and activism, was held, because that was also a kind of look back, look forward, and made so clear how absolutely brilliant we were when we made that decision that there is a place for that scholarship in the division, and it is now one of the largest, and certainly, if not the most, one of the most healthy divisions in terms of the quality of the work being done. And the caucus moves on with the issues of the political work, using political with a small p. And that was a wonderful move that was made in, 89, 90? It's on the timeline.
90.
Oh.
And the fact that we pulled it off in one convention.
Yes.
From Thursday to Saturday.
Because I was chair of the caucus when we went forward with that. And we had a major concern that when we brought this to the Legislative Assembly, that it would not be looked upon well. First, we named it. We didn't call it Women's Studies. We called it Feminist and Women's Studies. And that was kind of throwing things in people's faces. And so we had long conversations about how we could move forward and bring the names and the nomination and everything with it to the Assembly. And so we went once again to Sam Becker. And we said to Sam, we'd like you to go with us, we'd like you to support us. And he said, well, I don't know what I'm going to say. I said, all you have to do is sit there. That's going to be enough. And then Del Hardy Short and I brought our children.
Yep.
Which is too funny. And Anita, there was probably 5 or 6 of us, I think, that went forward. Did you go, Marlene?
I'm not sure that I did.
It says here, Anita Taylor, Cindy Lont, Dale Hardy Short, and Sam Becker.
Right. And so we
brought
came
the
up
signed
forward,
petition.
it came up for a vote, discussion, and it went so quickly and so well, we were all stunned. Because we were all there with, every arm ready to argue and explain why it was important and why it was going to happen. And they just went, bing.
I remember when you guys came back, we kind of couldn't believe it. You were like, it just sailed through. We're going, it did?
And there's a little backstory here, because the association was preparing for a change in the way that divisions would be created. And it was like the next year, you would have to do so many people as signing a petition or choosing membership, and there would be a kind of probation period. And we had this 1-year window, and it was Jim Galdino who pointed out that window and was quite supportive of our moving ahead on that.
And I do have for the archives a very nice memo from Cindy in 1990, outlining, before the conference, outlining some of the status of the caucus and saying, I've had this conversation with Jim Gaudino about how the new structuring in NCA might affect us, and if we go for a commission or so that can be a part of the archives.
And I remember I was in that conversation too when we were saying, could we do this? Could we do this? And then we could do this. I remember that.
It was Thursday afternoon at the conference when we met.
There was a concern stated about whether that would mean the end of the caucus, where the caucus wouldn't be vital in some way anymore. And it took us a while to tease out and explicate to ourselves what we're saying so much more clearly here, I think, and that is, these are two separate things, and they're joined at the hip, but they're separate.
And they both are needed.
That's right. And the fact that in recent years the caucus has occasionally had much lower attendance than the division is in many ways harks back to some of those early days when there were maybe a half dozen of us in the room, because we started from the beginning with the idea it is important to mainstream. It is important for each woman there, and there were mostly women, there were some men, to be sure that she establishes herself and her work in her own division. And the caucus is there for support and for an outlet if you don't get that. So there were lots of times we didn't have lots of people in the room, but that did not diminish the importance of the political work within the association that was being done. And in my opinion, that is a thing that remains true for the future, which I intend to use as a segue. And again, I will be guided by this, but we have about 20 minutes left. And our last question, which I would love for us to spend a little bit of time talking about, start with panel members and then call in those of you who are here, about, the 5 years out was also supposed to look down the road a bit and say, what are we going to be? What ought we to be? And so, unless there is a strong sentiment to go somewhere else, let's go there. And let's start with our new leadership. Do you have any thoughts? And we'll just kick this around. You don't have to feel that this is a platform on which you must run for the next 3 years. But do you have, is there something in mind of what you think this caucus ought to continue to be or become?
I like the direction that it's going in, the foundation that has been set, and we're doing a newsletter, we're into technology, we're doing the emails, maybe a Facebook page, I don't know, but
I heard that
more social networking. But the direction that we're going, I'm certainly pleased with it, and I would like to know more about what we as women are doing on our campuses. And are there other women's centers out there, and suggestions and thoughts on that, as well as, and there's the differences with the four-year universities as well as community colleges. So I'm at a community college, and so there are differences there, and the support that women get at a community college as opposed to a four-year university, and is that there? So that's some of the things that I'm looking at.
Okay.
I think you stay with what works and be open to new energies and ideas. I think we've always kind of tried to straddle this fence between being so mainstream that we didn't have the support activist kind of arm, and being separate and not doing the work in the divisions in the other areas. So I'm heartened to see some new people and say, great, this is going forward, this will continue. I think we've had a good run of women involved in NCA leadership beyond the caucus and the division, and so I would hope that the caucus continues to try to cultivate leadership, promote women into positions, because I don't think those things are all completely over. The need to keep that activism going. That's my take on it. So.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. I think that we need to be vigilant and careful not to be complacent, because we have had that good run of women in leadership. And I think one of the key roles of the caucus will be to continue to do that promotion of women actively putting women forward for awards, working within our individual units to make sure that women's voices and women's scholarship, as it is dispersed as well as it comes together in the Feminist and Women's Studies Division, continues to be promoted and recognized as the quality scholarship that it is. But since I've had the opportunity to be in the inner sanctum on the finance board and in the executive committee of NCA and seen the inner workings of the association, I know that there's much more to do. There's potential for continuing to promote the interest of this caucus and the other caucuses and to make sure those voices are heard.
Well, I would echo all of that. I think it's important for us to remain vigilant. It's important for us to continue to do the kind of programming, for example, where women have an opportunity to hear other women talk about how do you parent and maintain your career, how do you build your networks, all of those kinds of things. But I would also suggest that we think creatively about being more activists, not in the sense of what it is we do to promote women in NCA, but activists in how we promote our ideals outside of the academy. And so, I've always been interested in terms of feminist scholarship in the issue of feminist scholarship has to make a difference in the lives of women. And that means we have to do more than talk to each other. We have to be out in communities doing things. And yet we've never managed to figure out how we do that, to bridge that gap. We still remain intellectually centered among ourselves. We talk to each other. And I think it would be an interesting task for the caucus to take on, to think about how do you create that activism, how do you take the scholarship and move it to the public domain, both in terms of community activism, public intellectuals, but that the caucus might play a role in doing that.
Would you propose a program next year that is a talk program, not a present papers program, but a round table? Let's sit around and talk about it. Let's create a time slot to do it.
And bring in some of those dynamite women in San Francisco who are doing
That's
doing
exactly
that.
right. We are in a perfect place to do this.
That would be really terrific to bring in some of the actors. Yeah.
Because we need to launch it.
Yeah.
On November 5, I went to hear the lecture that is the Distinguished Women's Lecture that's sponsored by the Women's Center and by the Provost of the University of Minnesota, by Rose Brewer, who's a chaired professor in African American Studies and African Studies. And it's one of the most devastating lectures I have heard in a long time, and she and another group of women have edited a book called The Color of Wealth, which starts out with an analysis of the problems of Native American women, goes to African American women, goes to Latino women, and then and talks about the institutional ways in which these kinds of things have been perpetuated in the past and continue to be perpetuated in the present. And I'm one of the outliers. I believe that my activism needs to be in the classroom. I try to make sure that the history of racism is in every single class that I teach. I try to make sure that the history of women's struggle for rights and the kind of terrible conditions under which women lived continue to be taught always in the classroom. And there are inevitably students in my class who say, oh my gosh, I never knew anything about this. On the 40th anniversary of the Kerner Report, I played Bill Moyer's interview with Fred Harris, who was one of the members of the commission. Nobody in my class had ever heard of the Kerner Commission, and of course, its focus was on the terrible situation of African Americans in northern cities who rebelled against the terrible conditions that existed. The absolute absence of that information is part of the reason that the Jeremiah Wright stuff arose in the form that it did. I think you have to think very hard about how good a feminist and how good a fighter against racism you are in your own classroom before you start talking about now we need to go out into the community and do various and sundry kinds of things. Because let's face it, you're constantly talking to the people who are going to be the leaders in your community and in other communities. So while I support all the activism out in the community, absolutely, and have done a good bit of it, I really feel like we constantly have to be asking ourselves about activism in the classroom.
And that's another place that the caucus can be doing work, so that we can be doing panels about that. How do you provide that kind of activism in the classroom? But I guess I still fundamentally think that we talk about issues, we do work in areas that are of concern and importance to people in communities that will never be in our classrooms, and that we have a role to play there. And so in that sense, I'd like to see us figure out how do we have a public role, an activist role for the scholarship that we do.
Any sort of contradiction?
No, I don't think so either. I think they're both intertwined.
There are multiple ways
that
to be
you
an
do
activist,
that, right?
Including creating a women's center on campus.
Right,
I mean,
absolutely.
That's a campus-related thing that's also very active.
Incidentally, the Women's Center at the University of Minnesota is the oldest in the country.
Yeah, and a good place. I think about the bridge.
When is it born?
I think it's now 60 years that it's been in existence.
Wow.
If you can imagine.
That is amazing.
There's a bridge in some of the work that has been done, and the kind of themes that need more public display. I think about Who Cares, your work on who's doing the volunteer work, who, the unpaid labor for social justice. That's the kind of thing we can educate, not only in our classrooms about, but perhaps in the larger public sphere. NCA, if you look at the website now, you got, communication in the workplace, communication here, and there seems to be this thrust of, as I understand it, being more available and more out there in terms of communicating the impact of our scholarship.
Right.
Women's Caucus in the division can be a part of that, I think, if that's the kind of thing you're thinking.
Yes.
But I also
Yes, and then Sandy. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm a little nervous, but like you were asking, like what we see in the 5 years out. But what I like this. Sorry. I feel like I'm standing in a river right now. Like I'm being washed over with history.
Swim with it. We're all comfortable being your lifeguards.
But in my undergrad, my mentor was I did, so that's right. Was my mentor was a very strong female rhetorician, and now that I'm in a master's program, and all of my leaders are women, and so in 5 years, I really hope that we can have another history panel for people up and coming scholars like myself who are hearing stories for the first time and really feeling the impact, knowing where we've been and where we're going, and knowing how I can participate more. Coming from my mother's a construction worker, so I've heard lots of strife about being a woman in a male-dominated workplace, but I guess because as a child I was always so exposed to it, I kind of brushed it off and thought I can go into academia and I won't be in that situation. But hearing this, I do feel like I'm in the river and I'm having history and I'm going towards the future, but I'm feeling the history come. And if in 5 years we can have another one of these panels and bring folks like myself in who have literally no idea of what it was like, so we can, because I feel more inspired than ever before to become a part and be active. And I think this reflecting on the history, I wish more of my graduate students could be here, because I know they'd feel the same way. Is that we've to do more, to go forward more, because we have reflected on the past.
Yes, let me repeat my favorite statement of Gerda Lerner, where she says, first women, there were two terrible wrongs that were done to women. The first were that they weren't educated. The second was that they weren't taught their own history. Mm-hmm. And that's really the truth.
And it brings me back to what I wanted to say when we talked about what we're going to do in the next 5 years. Belle Edison and I sat yesterday at the Women's Caucus meeting, and they're talking about, bringing women leadership, all this kind of stuff. And I looked at Belle, and Belle looked at me and we said, we've heard this for 5 to 10 years, and we took care of it 5 to 10 years ago. Right. But somehow even though, we knew about the pipeline and all this other kind of stuff, what we learned and moved on never got communicated to everybody else there. And so it was a kind of a frustration going, been there, done that kind of thing, but we haven't been doing a really good job of saying, this is how it's laid out, this is how we can take care of it. Just this morning we're talking about trying to find files and this and that, and some of us know that Ivy may have it or so-and-so may. It just, I think it's frustrating for the new people coming in knowing they're trying to reinvent the wheel. It's frustrating for us who invented the first wheel, and now we're looking for somebody who's trying to do the same thing. So I would say in the next 5 years, what we need to do is identify our history and put it in some fashion that's not only accessible but useful. Because you can sit and read this stuff, that's nice, but it doesn't tell us how to use it to make things better for the caucus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think related to that, and also related to your comments, I was struck yesterday when we were talking about, at the Women's Caucus business meeting, about the need for doing some more mentoring panels, and I had the sense that what was sort of tacitly being talked about was the need to bring together senior distinguished women who have served as mentors to talk about how to be a great mentor. And I thought, wouldn't it be more productive to have a conversation with young women to say, what do you need? What should we be providing for you? Because we really did come of age at a different time with a different understanding and a different set of experiences. And we need to know more from you what you need.
It's kind of what I was going to say, something very similar. Moving from a four-year teaching college now to a research university with a doctoral program, and at this point in time, most of our PhD students are women. And I'm not even sure complacency is quite the right word, but maybe because the students, we've got a panel this afternoon, which I can't go to unfortunately, but are conscious of women's history and gender issues in communication. And maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they have much of a sense in relationship to themselves and their own role in the academy and their future, wherever they're going to be. I don't think we're preparing them well to think about what it's going to be like to teach at a community college where I taught and was tenured, at a four-year teaching-oriented institution where you may go into a department like I was in a Department of English and Communication, which was still majority male. So it's a kind of, and I don't know quite how to term it, but kind of a lack of experience with the reality of gender issues as they're going to impact you as you move your way through life. So it's a kind of activism within the academy,
and that's
preparing our students appropriately.
Yeah, that's where I was going to
and
bring
we don't
us
have to
back
wait 5 years to do it.
Right, because I think because there is a sense of, I think an important role of the caucus is that reaching out to community is in the classrooms, but it also is understanding what women's roles is, what they really are in the academy, and the work-life issues, the tenure issues.
It's more subtle, and I'm concerned because I see it. I see the way my female students are reacting to it, and I don't think it's always appropriate.
I think this is so funny because I was feeling kind of depressed after last night hearing about all this stuff in the Women's Caucus. This morning I said, brand new day, going to start out. Went down to get breakfast. There was a young woman behind me, and I said to her, are you eating breakfast with anybody? And she said, no, and I've eaten breakfast by myself all the time. And I said, come on, let's sit down. It's one of your students. Oh, Kim?
Kim Johnson?
Yeah, I think Kim. So we had breakfast, and all I did was listen. I had her talk about her dissertation. I had her talk about her job search. And, because I realized that I'm listening because my plate is empty and hers is still full because she's still been talking. And I thought, that's something that all of us can do anytime, just to have somebody, for them to talk at. And I think we made some good connections about other faculty, the places that she's looking to work. And I felt so much better than I did last night.
Well, and we talked about this last night when we had 2, 3, 5 years ago. I was
dining with the stars.
But, but not even the stars, but, people who are in this caucus and others that are, but aren't with us right now, but say, I'll be free for lunch at this time, and it could just be a sort of meet-up place. But I think that's a wonderful way to make new connections. And it's very lonely when you first start coming to NCA and you haven't found your path?
There's one thing I want to add because we haven't talked about it, and it's one of those visions that I know we had early and we have worked at from time to time, but it's still a vision and not a reality. And that is, I want us 5 years from now to have done a better job than we have done of reaching out to women of color. And whether that's by direct alliance with the caucuses or whether that's by promoting individuals and asking them to bring friends because we don't do the social contacts that we need to do, whether it's a social that is built around a sponsorship by the various caucuses when all we really do is just talk to each other at this social. That's what I would like for us to do in the future. And one of the things that's so frustrating about it is that I know we wanted to do that 20 years ago. We talked about it 30 years ago.
And some of it is scheduling.
Oh, yes,
Lord.
it is. That's right.
That's a good example of the fact that even though sometimes we feel frustrated, like, oh, here we go again, reinventing the wheel is never finished. That's and you young women will be ambassadors to bring more people in who will, and you'll go over some of the same conversations. Yeah, we'll try to share as much history as we can. But you'll have to rebuild your own networks or build your own networks, bring your own people on board. And that's okay. I mean, I remember when women's studies was approved at my university, it was approved with the caveat that we work ourselves out of business in 10 years. Well, that was 25 years ago. And as far as I'm concerned, the work's still going on.
There's still things to talk about.
So, keep on reinventing the wheel or polish it or whatever.
Wouldn't it be nice for there to be no need? Well, we have come very close to the appointed hour of the end. Are there any final words that anybody thinks we should say?
Well, we have a new person who joined us.
Yes.
Hi, Lee.
Yes.
Oh, yes, Lee Jacobs. I just stopped by because I think that's where I started. It was with the Women's Caucus and the feminist division or whatever. And then, I got involved in performance studies. And so I always feel bad because I really want to be at all these things too. So I just sort of came back to say it's so important what we do here and what you do. And I wish I could have been here all along, but I was around at the beginning, and I'm glad that it's still here and it's going to keep going.
When was your first caucus?
Oh Lord, let's see. Was my first NCA was probably 1978 or something like that. I don't know when did the caucus start.
Officially formed in 71. The first gathering was 70 that we know of.
Yes, so I guess I'm a latecomer then.
This is an important question then. When should we celebrate the decade anniversary? Should it be? So it should be next year that we should celebrate, as opposed to.
We gotta have a 40th birthday party.
Right. Exactly. That's what I'm asking. Is when do we have the 40th birthday party?
Yeah,
because which year do we want to choose?
And last time we did a big anniversary was in San Francisco.
Yeah.
That's when we did it.
That's correct.
In 80.
Perfect.
San Francisco is a great place to do it.
We're going to do that.
We'll have to have a party in San Francisco.
Sally Gerhardt's there, so she would come to a panel.
Yes, I was thinking of Sally.
Yes.
Okay, now here's the question. Was it the 72 meeting in San Francisco or 76 when we all sat in a big circle and Sally Gerhardt, I remember, I didn't even know who she was then. I was still trying to figure out who was Sonia and who was Karen. But
well, that took me 20 years.
But I remember Sally Gerhardt. I later met her. I remember that she sat in that circle and said, "We need to harness the collective power of our hot flashes and take over all of it."
Yeah, that's Sally.
And it blew me away. I thought,
That
whoa.
was 76.
That should have been 76.
That was 76.
Okay.
She was my mentor in San Francisco State. So
Okay.
She was at both of those meetings.
Okay.
When we were there in San Francisco, she came to both of them.
Well, I just raised that question about when are we going to have our 40th anniversary, because that would shift slightly, because it was in 1997 when we had the 25th. And
Yeah, we
so
weren't straight on our timeline.
Right. So now we can adjust the timeline. We got it right.
Nobody's going to care.
That's right. Nobody's going to care.
I suppose it's the question of the difference between the conception and the birth.
Before we leave, I do have some corrections for the timeline that are back in Sycamore, Illinois. But how do we want to process going forward and getting our data together?
That's a good question.
Is there a site where this can be placed? And then people at least would have access to looking at it. I guess we would need...
I suspect that the Women's Caucus would be willing to put it on their website.
And then corrections could be simply sent to whoever the webmaster is.
Yes.
And should documents and things be sent to the NCA archives? Do we trust them?
No, I think we should send them to Hy-Vee. Yeah.
You know, that's a good question, because there's the Women's Caucus archive that Ivy's keeping, and then there is the NCA archive.
One of the things that ought to be done is simply to duplicate it, so that there is a set at NCA and there's a set somewhere else.
I'm kind of like not wanting to put things in the mail without knowing it.
I don't know. I did all this gathering of material from the history of the Kansas Colored Women's Clubs, and all these things that have been destroyed by fire and water just made me crazy. And old people die, and then what they had in that old box, the kids look at and say, "Oh, you kick this out. This isn't important," etc.
You can scan stuff on this, which is nice. So you can scan stuff on, CDs and stuff. That may be keep the originals.
But I do think the idea of making a duplicate, sending one set to Ivy, one set to the NCA archives is a great idea. But the other question
but I
is
have panels that have to be sent somewhere, and those can't be duplicated.
Yeah, newsletters are hard to duplicate.
That panels should go to Ivy. Panels should go to Ivy.
Maybe it can be scanned.
But any additions or corrections to this timeline, you can send at this point. You can send it to me or to Marlene. My email is easy, ataylor@GMU, that's in George Mason University, edu. And I'll see to it that it gets to Marlene, who's the keeper of the file.
And mine's easy also. It's just fine, F-I-N-E, at Simmons.
Oh, hers is easier than mine. Yeah, all right.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you all.